Moving on to tonight's program, I would like to introduce Dr. Dan Enrique Ibarra of UC Berkeley. Now, I first met Dan in July of 2018 when he gave a short talk on his work at his in-laws' house here in Jackson. At that time, he was a PhD candidate at Stanford University. He has since received his PhD from Stanford and is now the Miller Research Institute and President's Postdoctoral Fellow, Earth and Planetary Science, University of California, Berkeley. So I have basically been working on getting Dan to give us a talk literally for years now. Okay, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dan. Thanks again, Dan, for being here, and we're all looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Cynthia. All right, is my screen showing?
Perfect.
And you can see me? Okay, great. Awesome, yeah, so I'm really excited to be here today to discuss some of the research that I did as part of my master's and PhD work at Stanford. I'm currently a postdoc at UC Berkeley, and this coming summer I will start as an assistant professor at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. So today I'll be discussing the rise and fall of latest Pleistocene pluvial lakes in the northern Great Basin. I started this image which is one that I thought was sort of appropriate for this presentation, with one that I think was appropriate for this crowd. My research group used to teach a field course in the Wind River range. This is the Dinwiddie Creek watershed where we visited every year for about 8 years. And this is Gannett Peak, viewed from the north. And to me, as someone who studies the Pleistocene paleoclimate of the American West, the thing that's most striking about this landscape is, of course, the large glacially carved U-shaped valley. And today, of course, there's a small glacier that you can just see, in this case, on the north side of Gannett Peak. But where I was standing and where I took this photo from was probably once covered by, say, 1,000 feet of ice. And so most of you, in fact, probably all of you living in Teton County know of the last ice ages, particularly as it involves, the Yellowstone ice cap and all the glaciers that carved the Tetons and the Wind Rivers. But additionally, in the basin and range, so in Nevada, Utah, Southern Oregon, et cetera, we have these horizontal shoreline features that you can see here. And these were studied by G.K. Gilbert in the late 1800s. He was the first chief geologist of the US Geological Survey. And in particular, Gilbert studied these shoreline features of Bonneville to basically, come up with a lot of things that we now know of in geology, such as uniformitarianism and also, various geomorphological concepts that we learn in our geology textbooks. And so these lakes and these glaciers and the climate of the Pleistocene has been a fascination of mine ever since I was an undergraduate. And one place that I think is just fascinating in California that some of you may have visited is on the east side of the Sierras. We have Mono Lake. And Mono Lake is, of course, famous for its tufa towers, but it was once much larger than it is today. So this is the outline of the prehistoric Mono Lake area before we started diverting some of this water to Los Angeles. But during the latest Pleistocene, near the last glacial maximum, this lake was probably 2 to 3 times as big. You can see this shoreline that's shown here. And in this case, you actually had some glaciers that were basically calving into at the edge of this lake. And we can find things like drop stones in the sediments of the Mono Lake sediments. And Mono Lake is part of what's known as a series of fill and spill lakes that lead all the way down to Death Valley along the east side of the Sierras. So other places you might have heard of are, for example, the Owens River and Owens Lake, Lake Searles, and then of course, Death Valley, which we call Lake Manly. And so this is a series of lakes that covered this whole sort of east side of the Sierras. And I recently was doing some field work right before the COVID shutdown. And this is a picture of conifer bark embedded by Lake Tufa that I found when I was doing some field work at Searles Lake. And today, of course, when you go there, there's sagebrush, it's desert. But back when we had these large lakes, there was clearly a very different ecosystem at the time. And that's, of course, recorded in the fossil record that we find in these tufas. And so this is a view of what the Western United States looked like during the last glacial maximum. So we had, of course, the Yellowstone ice cap up here, large glaciers in the Sierras and in Colorado. And then we had these really large lake systems, Lake Bonneville, which I'll spend quite a bit of time in the second half of my talk today discussing, as well as Lake Lahontan, the second largest of these pluvial lakes, and many other small lakes in the northern Great Basin that are shown here. And this is from a series of maps by Ron Blakey for those that are interested. Of course, most of you probably know or have heard of that during the last ice age, we also had a very large ice cap that covered all of Canada, known as the Laurentide ice sheet. And this ice sheet extended into the Midwest and deposited moraines in places in the Midwest. And it impacted the climate of the Western United States. And so during this time period, we had much lower CO2 than even the pre-industrial, than say, before human emissions increased CO2 to now 400 parts per million. But back at the last glacial maximum, CO2 was say about 180 parts per million. Sea level was much lower. So Florida, for example, would have been much bigger. The Baja region would have had more land down in here. And for example, the Bay Area in California would have been subaerial. So it would have been all land. You wouldn't have had a large bay or a large estuary as we do today in the Bay Area. And the impact of this ice sheet in North America, as well as ice sheets over Eurasia, are really important for driving the climate system that we think occurred in this actually geologic past that's really not that far from today. So 21,000 years ago. And today what I'll discuss is how I use lake deposits from these terminally draining basins like Lake Bonneville to directly quantify past changes in the hydrologic cycle. And I'll first go over a series of observations from a small lake in the northwestern Great Basin. This lake shown right here on the border of California and Nevada, Lake Surprise. And then I'll discuss Lake Bonneville and some modeling that I've done for that, and also talk about some future directions that I plan to work on in the next 5 to 10 years. So my field is that of terrestrial paleoclimatology. And so I'm a geochemist who's interested in using these various terrestrial archives to reconstruct the water cycle in the past. And what we'd like to know is in the past, some of the fluxes that you can see here on the left. So for example, we'd like to know how was precipitation different in the past, or how was runoff into rivers, streams, and lakes different? Or what were the net evapotranspiration fluxes from the soil and from the landscape, or the net infiltration fluxes through a soil? Of course, what we can actually measure are things like you see on the right. So we core lakes, for example. One of my good friends has been involved in some of the coring in the lakes in Teton National Park. And I'll show you some work today from that synthesizes some of the various a lot of the lake coring that's happened in the Western US that's fairly accessible to us. These are pack rat mittens that can be radiocarbon dated, and the pack rats basically scrounge up all the vegetation and pollen and leaves and things from the landscape around them, and they defecate on them, and they get preserved quite nicely in a way that we can actually see what the landscape looked like at the time in which these pack rats actually collected all of these parts of the landscape for us. And this is a speleothem. So this is a cave deposit that grows on the floor of a cave from dripping water. And me and many others measure the isotopic composition of these cave deposits. And so one thing that our group at Stanford, the research groups that I've been involved in, have really thought about doing in the last 5 to 10 years is saying, okay, we have all these different types of proxies, as we call them, these different archives, and we would really like to start to synthesize them. And we'd like to put them on maps and understand at a sort of continental or regional scale what the climate in the past looked like. And so this is some work that we originally published in 2015 in a paper in Nature Geoscience, and then my co-author and I updated and published in the Utah Geological Survey in 2019, where we basically compiled a series of these proxies that were dated to that time period that I started the talk on, 21,000 years ago. And so you can see that the symbols are for these different proxy types. So it's places where people have looked at the glacial moraines, They've cored lakes and looked at the pollen, so the vegetation in the area. They've looked at speleothem or groundwater deposits, soils, or actually looked at lake level stands, as I'll talk about today. And then what I've done here is I've color coded these dots based on whether they're wetter or drier relative to the present day. And so where you see a blue dot, that's where it's wetter. Where you see a red dot, that's where it's drier. And so you can see that in the Great Basin and in the sort of northern part of these inward draining basins in southern Arizona and New Mexico is perhaps wetter. But in a lot of regions, such as the Pacific Northwest, perhaps up in Wyoming, a lot of these proxies suggest that it could have actually been drier than today. And so this is useful information, and it's actually information that we can potentially use to probe our understanding of the climate system in a pretty fundamental way. And so one thing that we also do is we run climate models, and we use climate models basically as a tool for probing the processes that would result in the geologic observations that we make on the landscape. And so this is a climate model from an older paper now from 2011, where they have imposed an ice sheet on North America, and you can't see the continent, but it's basically where I'm tracing here. And you're seeing the actual precipitation and hourly time steps from this model. And so this is all just to say that we have climate models that are the same models that we use for projections of future warming that we also run for past time periods. So we run them for the Eocene 50 million years ago, or the middle Pliocene 3 million years ago, or in this case, the last glacial maximum 21,000 years ago. And today I'll sort of be using some of these climate models as comparisons, and I'm happy to talk about them more, but what I'm going to more talk about today is sort of the geologic observations that we make on the landscape. But what we can do with these models is we can then compare them to the geologic observations. So here is just an example of where I compare the last glacial maximum climate models with that whole map of the United States that I showed you with those proxies. And now the proxies are colored by their agreement or disagreement with the climate model, the average of the climate model, the ensemble of the climate model, of many climate models that go into this ensemble. And so where you see green dots is where they fully agree on the sign of change. Yellow dots is what we call a weak disagree. And red dots are places where they fully disagree. So the climate model says that it's wetter, but the proxy says that it should be drier, for example. And you can see that this is a pretty stark change in precipitation at this time. Something, for example, in Southern California, up to 50% increases in precipitation would substantially change the ecosystem that you might observe in that location. And so, the question, of course, is can these past climates reliably be used to test climate models? And to that end, what I would like to do with some of the work that I do is basically provide better estimates from the proxy side, from the observations, because we can't put rain gauges or thermometers out in, we can't know what the weather and climate was 21,000 or 3 million years ago. So instead we have to use the geologic record. And I would sort of argue that the geologic record is actually very useful for doing this. It has large potential foreseens that are unambiguous in their sign changes. The presence of lakes must mean something different about the water balance in a region. And also potentially we can look at spatial gradients. And so I really do think that they're an ideal test of climate model performance. But one thing that I sort of showed you and that you might have been dismayed by just now is that we would really like to be more quantitative. So saying that something is just wetter or drier relative to today doesn't actually help us, but saying that temperatures will be 5 degrees warmer, or that precipitation was 50% lower or higher in the past at a certain location is actually quite useful. And so to that end, I'm gonna sort of go through what I've been doing with lakes in the Western US to try and be more quantitative about, say, changes in precipitation or temperature, or P-E precipitation minus evapotranspiration in the past. And I won't discuss seasonal changes today, but I think that this is like a step forward that we need to eventually get to. So just to outline the remainder of my talk, so pretty much done with the introduction, I will show you a field study of Lake Surprise. And this all started with a paper that I published in 2014 in the Geological Society of America Bulletin. This was basically my master's thesis. Then the second part of the talk, I will show you some forward modeling of Lake Bonneville. That's what we published also in the Utah Geological Survey publication a couple of years ago, but it's really based on a paper that I published in the journal Geology in 2018. And then throughout, you'll sort of see this comparison to some of the climate models, and I'll show some more of the maps that I've already been showing. So just to orient you, for those that are not geologists or are not familiar with sort of the Pliocene-Pleistocene global temperature and climate, this is a view of what global temperature, what we think global temperature has looked like over the last 5 million years, broken up into 3 segments. They're linear within each segment. These are from 5 million to 1 million, the benthic foraminifera. And then these are some of the ice core records that you can see here in the blue and the light blue. And the last glacial maximum was 21,000 years ago. It's the last time that CO2 was depressed at about 180 parts per million. And one thing that you can see here is the stark Milankovitch cycles of the last several cycles of these glacial-interglacial cycles. And so you can see that for the last particularly 800,000 years, we've had this roughly 100,000 year rhythm in which the Earth has transitioned between interglacials, such as the Holocene, what we are experiencing now, but really, changing because of our own emissions, but between that and these interglacial time periods, the ice ages. And so today I'm really going to discuss the last glacial maximum and sort of keep in mind that this is all part of this long-term cooling trend that's part of the Pliocene, that, the last time that global temperatures were something like we might observe by the end of the 21st century was, say, 3 or 4 million years ago. And I'm happy to talk about that as well, or that's also sort of part of some of the other work that I do. Okay, so let's focus now on this sort of field study of Lake Surprise, California. And so the name, as the title of my talk implies, is that these lakes are known as pluvial lakes. And this is derived from the Latin word pluvialis, meaning pertaining to the rain. And so the hypothesis here, sort of intuitively, is that these lakes are really driven by precipitation, or driven by changes in precipitation that lead to these lakes to be very large. And one thing that I'll show you over the course of this talk is that, yes, the high stands, so when these lakes reach their highest shorelines, might have been driven by these sort of pluvial conditions, by precipitation changes. Some of the growth of these lakes is probably also driven a lot by the fact that it was much colder, by the fact that evaporation rates were suppressed because of the colder temperatures. And one thing that you can do is you can look at the climate models that I showed you. And this gray zone is what we call basically the transition zone, where our statistical agreement between the proxies, the dots, and the model, the colors, is really no change relative to modern. And we call this the transition zone because it's between the wet and the dry dipole that's shown here. And really the models, at least from this generation of models, which is admittedly now 5 or 6 years old, but there'll be some new models that are all coming out right now. Basically, the models are equivocal for whether, especially the northern Great Basin, so Utah and northern Nevada, were wetter or drier relative to today. They basically would suggest that there was no change. But of course, we know, from all of the geologic observations that I'll show you and that others have worked on, that these large lakes existed. And so this presents a little bit of a paradox, right? But what I'll show you is that part of this has to do with the geochronology, with the timing of those lakes' high stands, and part of this is probably what I said earlier, which is that it's related to the decreased evapotranspiration rates. Okay, so here is Lake Surprise. It's right on the border, as I said, between California and Nevada. It's a small inward draining basin that is to the northwest of this large basin, Lake Lahontan. And it's in this, what we term the transition zone between the wet and the dry dipole. And one reason that I chose to study this lake originally for my master's work is that it's really small and it's responsive to forcings. And so large lakes like Lake Lahontan that you can see here have many different subbasins, and these subbasins don't integrate. Depending on where the lake levels are, they might not necessarily integrate. And of course, that then makes them harder to use as a climate signal. But these smaller lake systems are, small and therefore more responsive to these sorts of forcings. And so one thing I've always found really fascinating about the lakes that are in the Northwest Great Basin is that they also are sort of hypsometrically some of the most interesting. And so I'll show you what I mean by that. So this is a plot of the watershed coverage, and it's a log scale. So the percent of the terminal watershed that's covered versus the lake depth, and it's the lake depth in meters. And so all I've done here is I've taken all the grid cells of a digital elevation model for a given lake basin, and I've tallied them up. I've summed them, or I've rank ordered them, and I'm plotting the watershed coverage, and all the gray lines are all the lakes to the southeast and the south of the Northwest Great Basin, and the red lines are these lakes in the Northwest Great Basin. And surprisingly, these are some of the largest and the proportionally largest and some of the deepest lakes in the Great Basin. And here's Lake Surprise. It's basically one of the deepest, although I don't have Lake Bonneville on here because it's quite difficult to make this calculation for Lake Bonneville because it was an overflowing basin, as I'll discuss later in the talk. And it was equally as deep. Okay, so what's our sort of field approach? So our approach that we used was to do what we call a shore-based approach. And this is a pretty classic approach that has been sort of spearheaded mostly by scientists out of Denver from the US Geological Survey, studying some of the larger lakes, but really started with G.K. Gilbert studying those lake shorelines in Lake Bonneville. And so we're looking at here on this picture over to this 200 meters of lake level change, which is just incredible. And we can look at these shorelines at a variety of places along the basin, and we're going to date carbonate or tufa deposits on these lake shorelines to reconstruct the lake elevation through time. And so we got some funding from NASA back when I was a student to fly LiDAR imagery across some of these shorelines, because they're also analogs for what we might observe on Mars. And so there's a lot of interest in understanding, the morphology and the character of some of these shorelines because of some of the potential lake basins that exist on Mars. So this is this LiDAR imagery. You can see this is the exact shoreline imagery, just sort of rotated as what you see in the photograph above. This is the playa to the left, so this is uphill to the right. And we collect samples basically along some of these shorelines. We walked transects and we looked for samples. We took GPS points, etc. We also had some very diligent students working at Central Washington University after I had finished my master's work, who were master's students with Ann Egger, where we also who traced all of these shorelines around the basin, and basically were able to show and demonstrate that these shoreline sets exist in all the way north and south all along this basin, and we can connect them. We can see the same sorts of patterns in terms of the series of elevations that we observe, and we can date shorelines in one part of the basin, such as where these white dots are, versus other parts of the basin, these black dots, and actually find that they give similar ages at similar elevations, sort of validating our methods. And then one thing I won't discuss too much, but that we go into in this Geological Society of America special paper, is the idea that a lot of these shorelines are actually cut by faulting. So of course, the basin and range is all these normal fault half grabens that make up these basins, and when the water evaporates going into the Holocene, and that you no longer have a lake, you unload the sort of pressure from that water, and we actually think that some of these resulted in fairly large earthquakes at the time of when these lakes were desiccating. And so here you can actually see one of these normal faults cutting some of these paleo shorelines. But I won't go into that in any more detail today. So what we targeted are thin, dense carbonate samples that were found mostly on bedrock. So this is a piece of basalt with some, less than a centimeter thick carbonate. We also focused on what we call tufa glomerates. And then we would date mostly these shoreline capping tufa, which we think have to exist in near the photic zone because they probably are associated with microorganisms that help to precipitate this carbonate. And so the idea here is that we're recording a minimum lake level at the age in which the sample was deposited. And then we date the sample using two methods. We use radiocarbon geochronology, so carbon dating, and then we use uranium isotopes, so the decay of 238 uranium and its first two long-lived daughter products, 234 uranium and 230 thorium. I won't go into the details here, but the gist is that we double date the samples just to see if there's any problems with either of the dating systems, because there can be issues with both. And so what we found is actually what's found in Bonneville and found in a lot of lake system is that the lower shorelines are last glacial maximum in age, and the higher shorelines are younger. They were deglacial, so they were younger than 21,000 years ago. In addition, we also had several uranium thorium ages that were even higher from samples that came from these sort of shoreline-like structures that appeared to be sort of eroded in the LiDAR imagery. And these are actually dated to the previous glacial period, probably in the marine isotope stage 6. But I think what's most interesting is when you put this on a plot versus time. So here's what that looks like. So here I'm going towards the present to the left, so 35,000 years ago to the present. So here we are here, 0 today. And then here I'm plotting just the elevation of the sample. And in the black, I'm showing the radiocarbon ages, and in the gray, I show the uranium series ages. You can also see that humans inhabited the shorelines of some of these playa lakes at times, particularly famously in some of the places in Oregon that have evidence for some of the earliest humans in North America, the Paisley Cave sites. But one thing you can observe here, right, is that the last glacial maximum, like I said, had sort of moderate lake levels, less than 100 meters total from the base where today's playa is. And then that this lake level really jumped up. It sort of gradually grew, and then it jumped up at about 16,000 years ago. And in some previous work, I suggested that this would require something like a 75% increase in precipitation versus modern to drive this high stand rate. And I'll do some additional modeling in the second part of this talk, which I'll get to in a second, to try to show that maybe this was an overestimate. But regardless, in order to have such a rapid increase in lake level, with really not much of a potential change in evapotranspiration and temperatures, you really do require that there be a pretty large increase in precipitation. And so what are we recording? Well, one thing that we think we're recording is basically the northward shift of the storm track. And so today, most of our storms hit the West Coast in the Oregon, Washington area, and we're lucky and we're happy when rain hits us in California. But it was likely the case in the last glacial maximum that a lot of these westerly winter storms that we received were more centered around Southern California, Southern Nevada, and Baja in Mexico at the time. And this is because of this large high pressure system that sat over the Laurentide ice sheet and basically steered this storm track further south than it does today. And so if that's the case, we should see a south to north dipole movement in this dipole. So we should see that these lake high stands progressively get younger going south to north. And so here I've just listed a couple of them on this map that I showed you. So Lake Lahontan is 15.7, Lake Surprise, 15.2 to 16,000, and Chuacan, this is where Paisley Caves, some of the earliest evidence for humans on North America comes from, is about 14,000 years ago. And so, I think we sort of, at least at this small regional scale in Northwest Nevada, Southern Oregon, we have this dipole movement. But there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'll show you a map towards the end of some of the places I plan to go to really interrogate this. Okay, so just some takeaways from the first half of what I've presented. I think that it's clear that the shoreline ages really do record this systematic transgression and regression of lake levels. And this is really powerful in these small lakes because they're, to some extent, they're serving as our rain gauge in the past. Pluvial does appear to be true for the high stand, but maybe not for the still stands, and I'll show you some evidence of that coming up. And at least at Lake Surprise, at this border, at the sort of right below the southern border of Oregon, we think that this dipole seems to shift northward at about 16,000 years ago. Okay, so then in the second part, I'm going to show you a model that I developed as part of my PhD work, and I'll specifically apply it to Lake Bonneville. And so the idea here is that the spatial distribution and the area of these lakes relative to their watersheds basically provide a direct metric of past moisture balance. And I've sort of already alluded to this, but you pretty much don't have all that many other ways to add or remove water from a basin when a basin is terminal, when there's no river flowing out to the ocean. And so we can use basically this metric of the lake area relative to its basin area as a way to interrogate the water and the energy budget that's shown here. And I should say this is a sort of a common thread in the literature that has been going on for 40 plus years. I think John Kutzbach at University of Wisconsin really pioneered this, basically saying that the lake area relative to its basin area is recording the lake evaporation rates, the evapotranspiration rates, and the precipitation rates, and basically how those all balance out. And you have to maintain mass balance in the Earth system, otherwise these lakes wouldn't exist and provide the geomorphic evidence that they do. And so the fact that they were long-lived enough to say carve the shorelines that we can walk up and down suggests that we can make assumptions about the set of equations that we'll use and be able to perhaps infer how changes in precipitation or temperature were in the past. So I developed a model that was really based off a suggestion in a paper in the Journal of Climate by Wally Broecker, who is a very famous paleoclimatologist who some of you may have heard of from Columbia, from the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And Wally basically suggested that you need to use a certain formulation to relate the runoff coefficient. So that is how much precipitation actually goes into the lake versus evaporates from a landscape to help enforce the mass balance within a model like the one I'm about to show you. And importantly, what he suggested is that we use what's known as the Boudico framework. And this Boudico framework is very common in hydrogeology for studying, catchment water fluxes. And then in addition, we need a term that's primarily temperature dependent to scale our lake evaporation rates. And I'm not going to really go into the details here, but I'm happy to discuss them more. But basically, this suggestion by Wally Broecker really is what allowed me to then make this advance that came in that geology paper in 2018. Okay, so let's apply this sort of idea to Lake Bonneville. And so Lake Bonneville is a fascinating lake, the largest of these glacial lakes. And today, here's the outline of the Great Salt Lake. Salt Lake City's over here. Lake Bonneville had sort of two main lake areas or lake stands: the Bonneville shoreline, which is this darker blue, larger area, and then the Provo shoreline. And actually, the Bonneville shoreline spilled through Red Rock Pass into the Snake River Basin, and so it was an overflowing lake for this time period after it reached its high stand, broke its sill, and then was at sort of a pretty steady state. It's what we would call a balance-filled lake for a long time when it was at this Provo stand. The other thing that's just incredibly fascinating about Lake Bonneville is that we have to actually, the lake was so large and so deep that we have to correct our observations for the fact that it depressed the Earth's crust. And so these are what the corrected areas and volumes of this lake would have been. And this is just the data sources that I'm going to use in the modeling. But I wanted to highlight some of this work that came from one of my close friends, Christine Chen, who's a a postdoc at Caltech now, but she did her PhD at MIT in Boston, where she looked at the shoreline elevations around the edges of this lake for the Bonneville shoreline. And this is the distance from the basin center. Here's the present day shoreline elevation. And what you can see is that the basin has rebounded most significantly in the center of the basin by up to, say, I think that's about 70 meters at the shorelines around some of these what were islands back in the past. And I find this, this is just absolutely fascinating that in this case, you have Earth's climate 21,000 years ago impacting the elevations that we observe on Earth's surface, not too long afterwards. And you would think that that would only be sort of related to tectonics, but in this case, it's really related to, the fact that it was much wetter back during the last glacial maximum. Okay, so now to just continue with the sort of lake model. So this is what Lake Bonneville, the modern Bonneville climate looks like. So this is mean annual temperature versus the total annual precipitation. So I think Salt Lake City today receives about 400 millimeters per year. So sort of in the middle of this cloud that you show here. And then what I'm going to do is basically take these distributions and multiply them by changes in temperature and changes in precipitation. Okay, so that's what I'm doing here. So here's temperature on the x-axis versus a factor change of precipitation on the y-axis. And the first thing is that the modern, our modern lines should fall through no temperature change and a factor change of precipitation of 1. So this is today. And this positive slope that you see on this graph should be hopefully intuitive to you, that if you make things colder, you need less precipitation to cover the same amount of area in a given basin. And so this modern 6.7% is, if I just go back here, that is the Great Salt Lake plus Utah Lake and actually the Bonneville Salt Flats, which sits out to the west over here. So now we can run this model for all changes in temperature and precipitation that we might observe. Basically just like a hypothetical scenario. But what we're doing here is we're contouring on this metric, this area of the lake over the area of the basin. And so what you can see is that it's nonlinear. And this is this sort of advance that Wally Broker suggested, where we use this Boudico relationship, which creates this nonlinear forcing in the model. And what's great about this is we can then put our geologic observations on there. And so we have the Provo shoreline and the Bonneville shoreline contoured on here in the green and the purple. But keeping in mind that during the Provo time, the lake was actually eroding, it was flowing through its sill and overflowing. So it was a balance filled lake. And so this would be a minimum line basically that's shown on here. We can also compare this to macrofossils. So these are these pack rat mittens and other sorts of paleovegetation reconstructions that tell us how much colder it was in the past. And we essentially therefore know what range is reasonable to be on in the x-axis. And then in doing so, we can make a prediction as to how much wetter it must have been to have these, to drive these lake levels that we observe for Lake Bonneville, for the Bonneville shoreline and for the Provo shoreline. So 1.2 to 1.4x increases. For those of you who have, perhaps skied in the Wasatch Range, you'll know that there's also these really large glaciers that carved the canyons of this area. And so this is an example from one of my good friends, Brendan Quirk, who's a postdoc now at UMass Amherst, of the Little Cottonwood Canyon area. And he's modeled in the same way that I just modeled the lake levels, he's modeled what temperature and precipitation would be required to have this large glacier exist in the Little Cottonwood Canyon area. And now he actually has a paper that just came out where he's done this among a series of glaciers in the Wasatch. But this is quite useful because it's time equivalent to the lake that existed to the west. And in fact, it also probably calved into the lake right here at the shoreline that's shown here. But glaciers and lakes have very different temperature precipitation sensitivity. So lakes are very sensitive to changes in precipitation, as I've shown you. So they have a shallower slope in this space, whereas glaciers, the two red lines, so this is the modeling from the last slide basically, are much more sensitive to temperature. They have a steeper slope in this space. And so because we know these are roughly time equivalent, we can start to zero in on the, basically the climate space in which the lakes and the glaciers must have existed at this time. And so what we're coming to is that, you know, say it was about a 7 degrees colder temperature, 7 to 8 degrees colder with some elevated precipitation in order to drive these observations. And so finally, one of the things I'm working on here at Berkeley during my postdoc, and that I'll be setting up in my future lab starting this summer, is what's known as carbonate clumped isotopes. And so carbonate clumped isotopes are looking at the carbon-13 and oxygen-18 and the additional clumping of these two isotopes in calcite, like the tufa, the tufa deposits that I analyzed in Lake Surprise. And we actually had a master's student from UCLA measure a series of these samples from Lake Bonneville. And we actually found temperature depressions that were a little bit colder, which are these dots that are shown here, relative to the modeling that I just showed you. And we haven't worked out the details of this yet, but you know, there is clearly a little bit of a discrepancy, but within error, between the carbonate, the geologic record-based estimates of changes in temperature and the pure just sort of mass balance modeling that I showed you. But one thing that's interesting is these predictions, both the carbonate clumped isotopes as well as my predictions from just the mass balance modeling, suggests that Lake Bonneville was driven by precipitation throughout. However, a lot of these climate models, and this is just one of the best scoring climate models, here's the Great Salt Lake, suggests that the Northeast Great Basin, for example, was drier, not wetter relative to today. And you know, this is hard to parse out because when you look at a series of the models that you know, are some of the best, or the ones that we do think show the best comparison with the proxies shown here. This is 3 other models. For those that are interested, this model on the left is sort of the primary American model, the NCAR model based out of Boulder. You know, differences in precipitation that are not the same, and that you can see these spatial patterns that are quite different. And some of this may be due to model resolution, and as climate models become higher resolution, you can sort of see some of the grids here that they're not particularly high resolution over a region that we know, of course, is topographically very complex with the Sierras and the Great Basin and the Rocky Mountains. But also it could be due to certain biases in the models. And so there's you know, one thing to look at that's important is this high pressure system. So here I'm showing that same high pressure system that I pointed out earlier, and you know how strong this high pressure system is in some of the models and its interaction with the Aleutian low. So this is the sort of main low pressure system that drives westerly moisture into the western US during the winter time when we receive a lot of our rain is really important. And so there's a series of models coming out right now as a part of the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change model ensembles that I'm planning to look at and compare it to the same proxy network that I've been discussing. And then just finally, obviously I love to do field work, and so one thing I'm currently planning to do is to visit a whole bunch more of these sites and gain funding to be able to do work on more of these lakes in a lot of these smaller basins. And so the red dots that I show here are places like Lahontan and Surprise and Chuacan and Bonneville, where the lake levels are relatively well known and the geology, the Quaternary geology, is worked out to the point where we're more or less confident in the geochronology associated with these shorelines. But you can imagine that having a greater network of these sites, in particular to the southeast and to the northwest, where we have some of these small basins that can really sort of act as nice recorders of the moisture budget in the past, will be really useful. And so I'm planning to start doing, you know, more mapping and dating work in a lot of these regions in the future. So To conclude, I think it's clear that the role of evaporation still has to have been somewhat crucial in establishing these lake systems, but the pluvial response must be what's driving these high stands that we observe. I showed you these scaling relationships using lake area, and it might seem very first order, but it's sort of what we have right now in order to constrain the regional to watershed scale moisture budget. I personally think that these small lake systems are potentially really useful for understanding the types of questions that I'm asking here. And I think they're also useful in other places. You can probably imagine that in the Atacama or places like in Tibet, where we also have these small lake systems that can tell us about changes in the monsoon or the westerlies. It can be quite useful for reconstructing climate in the past. And then, you know, clearly there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity and seasonality that I didn't discuss today. And a lot of more work needs to be done on both the geologic observations, and I showed you that I sort of want to build out some of these sites in the future, and also the modeling. So I sort of ignored groundwater today, if there are any geologists in the room, or sort of interbasin flow. There must have been interbasin flow between some of these large basins in the past, for example. So with that, I'd like to thank our funding, in particular NSF and NASA grants that funded a lot of my work during my graduate studies, as well as everyone who's listed here who are co-authors on some of the papers that I published. My current funding is from the Miller Institute and the UC President's postdoc. And then I'm happy to take some questions. I wanted to advertise that I'm starting a faculty position this summer, and if you happen to know any students or postdocs who would be interested in doing this sort of quaternary paleoclimate type of work, I'm always interested. And then in addition, I recently founded a group called AEPI in Geoscience, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Geosciences. We had a kickoff meeting at the American Geophysical Union in December, and we're seeking, in particular, senior mentors in geoscience fields who may be from some of your networks that are in industry, academia, or nonprofits to, mentor, in particular, starting out undergraduates and graduate students who are seeking to get degrees in geology, geophysics, environmental science, etc. And I'm happy to share with people. We published a post on Medium, which is a website today, sort of explaining this group. So yeah, thank you. I hope I didn't go too long. So
I take it that would be the end right now, Dan. Thank you
that's
very
right,
much.
Mike.
This was incredible. An enormous amount of information about our neighborhood, and so I want to thank you for a terrific talk, and we have questions. So I'm going to start. So 16,000 years ago, there's this enormous expansion in lake levels. It doesn't coincide with the LGM, the last glacial maximum. Can you talk about why this expansion happened when it happened?
Yeah, so we're still not entirely sure. But one thing that we do know is that there was some significant retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet at this time. And so this time period around sort of the late, so this period from 19,000 to about 14,500 is what's known as the Heinrich Stadial 1. And during this Heinrich Stadial, you had a series of potentially, you can still see my screen, is that right? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So you could have had some of these meltwater forcing events in the North Atlantic. This is what has been hypothesized for a long time. And that, along with the weakening of this high pressure system, could have caused this dipole to move south to north. And you might be asking, well, why didn't you show me a bunch of climate models that were run for 16,000 years ago? Well, one issue is that we don't have very many climate models. We have basically one good model, and it's not particularly high resolution. And so, one thing that the paleoclimate model community is doing right now is they're running a series of model experiments that will, if I go to my lake level record, that will, that will span this whole period from 21. Well, particularly, they're going to run climate models that run from 21 or 23,000 to 10,000 years ago. And that will really allow us to answer the dynamical questions about what was happening at the time. But, we do have to reconcile that with the geology as well.
Another question.
Mm-hmm.
There have been many glacial cycles during the last 2.6 million years,
Mm-hmm.
and you're primarily looking at the last one. How much evidence is there of the previous glacial cycles?
In the lake records?
Yes.
Or
in
yeah,
your
so
work.
In my work. So in my work, we had about I don't want to misspeak, but it was 2 or 3 ages from these very high elevations, suggesting that there were lakes during the marine isotope stage 6, which is the glacial cycle before the last glacial maximum. Other work from particularly Meredith Reheis at the US Geological Survey in Denver has shown that a series of these other basins also have even higher high stands during probably marine isotope stage 6. And why that is, we're not sure, but of course, I'm not super clear on the glacial geology, but I'm pretty sure that this is the difference between the Pinedale and the Bull Lake chronologies that are observed in Wyoming in the Wind Rivers, for example. And the Bull Lake also has larger glaciers. And so at this time, it appears that both the glaciers and the lakes, and the Bull Lake is the marine isotope stage 6, both of these time periods had larger glaciers and larger lakes 120,000 years ago or so. Or sorry, 130,000 years ago.
So the earlier glaciations were actually larger than the one that you were presenting most of your evidence around.
That's right. So this glacial that's at, it's a little skewed in here. Sorry, I misspoke. It's at about 135,000, I believe. Had even larger lakes and glaciers than the last glacial maximum. That's right. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe there's much evidence for some of these other glacial cycles having larger lakes. The problem, of course, is that the transgression and regression of these glaciers and lakes scrapes away potentially some of the geologic evidence that we have for them existing during the previous cycles. So that's where lake sediment cores are really the key to understanding these glacial-interglacial cycles from the terrestrial, from the lakes.
Could you talk a little bit about tufa and
Mm-hmm.
how is it formed? It's a calcium carbonate, but
Yeah.
It's different than limestone. And under what conditions is it formed, and do you find it?
Yeah, so it's actually found in a lot of different settings under a lot of different conditions. So the classic, what some of you will sort of know just probably from either going there or seeing photos, is the large tufa towers in Mono Lake. And there's also paleo tufa towers in Searles Lake, where you had groundwater discharge that's a little bit hot, super saturated with calcite, hitting fresher water or somewhat fresher and definitely colder water, and then precipitating calcite. And that's what causes some of these towers to basically grow and form. In other places, like in Lake Surprise, we observe these tufas to form, I unfortunately don't have a great photo, but this is an example on some bedrock. They're just forming on the lake shoreline, and we presume from their laminated nature that they're associated with microbes that are respiring some carbon, potentially concentrating carbonate ion, and you have a calcium source coming from, say, the basalt or the lake water, and slowly precipitating these tufa. We know, I dated the inside and outside of some of these tufa, and they're like statistically the same age. So they're not growing super slowly, but they're growing at the point where they basically represent a very short window into the lake, a short glimpse into the lake level at the time in which they precipitated. You can also have, it's more called you can have travertine that's associated with streams that are degassing, that can cause saturation of carbonate, and in that case it's an entirely inorganic process. But there's carbonate precipitating all over the landscape, and in a lot of these places, when you have enough primary productivity in the landscape or in the lake, you have enough carbon there, and as long as you have the calcium to match it, you're probably going to precipitate at least some carbonate, either aided by biology or inorganically. And I'm certainly not an expert, but there's a lot that's been done on the morphology of this tufa and what it means in terms of the sort of paleo environment and almost the geobiology of what's occurring when they're precipitating, because they also, they look somewhat like a lot of the stromatolites that are some of our earliest evidence for microbial mats in the early fossil record, and in the Archean, for example.
So this leads into another question: were these lakes salty? And I mean, they're draining off landscapes that have lots of carbonate in them, and they're closed basins. How fresh is this water?
That's a great question. Well, surprisingly, well, maybe it's not surprising. A lot of these lakes were probably still pretty salty. Not as salty as the Great Salt Lake today. But when people who have sort of looked at the salt budgets of these suggest that they had to have been pretty salty. The lakes in Southern California were probably very salty, and they're not shown on this map, but those lakes have really thick evaporite deposits associated with the desiccation of these lakes. And so that, they were certainly very salty. Lake Surprise, Lake Lahontan, Bonneville, some of these other smaller lakes, I don't think they were, I don't think they were anywhere near the Great Salt Lake today, but they certainly weren't super fresh. One thing we can do, I didn't show you the results of this, but my hydrologic mass balance model does basically model it gives me the residence time of the water in these lake basins. And so the next step is actually to do exactly that. Assume some weathering rate, and we know the runoff into the basin, and then we can do the salt budget. So we could account for the sodium content of the lake, for example. And I have a friend who's now a professor at Penn State, Michaela Ingalls. She took a whole bunch of my tufa samples as well as a whole bunch of other people's tufa samples, and she's actually looking at the sodium and the phosphate that's in some of this carbonate and trying to infer by cross-comparing different lake basins that are time equivalent, which ones were basically saltier versus others. How fresh were some of them versus the others? Of course, Mono Lake today is very weird. It has all this weird sort of hot springs and other springs that cause it to be very alkaline. But I think that's really an exception, not what we potentially observe in these other places. So that's a great question. That's like a really nice next step, actually, to go that direction. So.
Good. And Sear Lake is very well known for its halite samples.
Halite, yeah, of course. Yeah.
So is there other confirmation of the extremely dramatic, almost seemingly instantaneous changes in precipitation that your data shows? It seems incredibly fast and dramatic.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it's the same type of data, but it's been reproduced at a whole bunch of different lakes. I skipped over this slide, but I guess since the question was asked, this is a great opportunity to show this. So here I'm showing Lake Lahontan, Lake Franklin. This is the same Lake Surprise data, but they didn't have all of our published ages at the time. And this is Lake Chuacan. And in particular, Lake Franklin. So Lake Franklin is the lake just next to Lake Bonneville, and Lake Surprise, as well as to some extent Lake Lahontan, do show these very large potential increases in lake elevation at this time. They're not all, as I was saying, they're not all entirely synchronous, which suggests there's some sort of forcing mechanism here causing them to not be all entirely synchronous. But yeah, all of the evidence though does come from these from the shoreline ages. One issue is that we would like to see this geomorphologically, but the problem is that then when you have the recession of these shorelines, the wave cut erosion from the recession actually gets rid of the geomorphic evidence that we might be able to observe that would allow us to look at this, say in beach dunes or something like that. So, you know, I've talked to some of my sedimentology friends and said, like, well, could we look at the sedimentology of some of the beach deposits associated with these lakes? And they said, yeah, but you kind of have this, there's sort of an issue here where you're going, you know, it's easier to record a fast recession than it is to record a transgression to the high stand, basically, in this sort of setting, if that makes sense.
Is there any reason to think that during all of our glacial periods that these lakes would have formed during every one of them? Is that a good assumption?
It is a good assumption. Yeah, so I've been working on a core from this valley that's shown here. So this is Clayton Valley. Mono Lake is sort of off the map to the left here. And one thing that you can see from a lot of these cores is that it's not that dry and arid is the norm over the last 2 million years. It's that wet and cold is more the norm of what's being recorded. And this is what I was saying, is that the next step is you have to look at the sediment cores. And so, you know, at least in this basin in Clayton Valley, you can see these fairly thick sequences. This is halite, but you can see these fairly thick sequences of fine-grained muds that are lacustrine muds in a lot of these basins. And so, you know, clearly towards the present in some of these cores, you do see some coarse sediments, but you know, yes, basically is the answer, that probably during a lot of these glacial periods, it was a lot wetter than it is today. And that's perhaps the norm for the Great Basin, not the Holocene, which is drier. So,
do you find evidence for fossil flora and fauna that were living in these lakes and might actually confirm or help identify a saline level?
Ooh, I don't know the answer to that question. I was going to say we do find evidence that from some of the trout and other fish species that some of these lakes had to have been connected in the past, either by rivers or you know, drainage divides being different than today or the latest Pleistocene. But I don't know about saline levels, like being able to actually essentially use the flora and fauna as a way to reconstruct that. I know that's been done, for example, in the Green River Formation in southern Wyoming, which, you know, I'd have to look and see if that's been done at all for any of these lakes, but I don't think it has been. That's a really nice idea, whoever asked that question.
So how quickly did this sort of dewatering of this of the basin and range, you know, this area happen? I mean, it went from super wet and lakes everywhere to like nothing.
To like pretty dry. Yeah. Yeah. No, it happened pretty quickly. So in those time series that I showed you, they you know, a lot of these lakes dried out by 10,000 years ago. You know, they Lake Surprise perhaps persisted a little bit, but, you know, for example, Lake Lahontan, you know, there's almost no evidence for these lakes existing, you know, after that. You know, they might have been smaller, like smaller playa lakes that were not very deep, but they're nothing like these 100-meter deep lakes with, you know, covering a third of their watersheds, for example. And you know, that's a fascinating also for the archaeologists, for example, because humans lived on the edges of a lot of these lakes, and that must have been a pretty annoying for them when they all dried up. They must have probably moved east or something. I mean, I know that a lot of the archaeological ages around these lakes are during, you know, between 14 and 12,000 years ago, for example, and then there aren't very many until later on in the middle Holocene, for example. So, yeah.
And so could these have actually like emptied in a generation, a human generation? I mean, is it that type? Is it really, is it that, how quick is it?
How quick is it? I don't think we have the geochronology. Yeah, we don't have the constraints to do that or to know that. But that's a great question. You know, I mean, this is the issue. You know, we can't a priori know the age of these samples when we pick them up from the field. So perhaps the best way to know that sort of thing is actually looking at cores. So this is a record from a core that's looking at grain size. This is from Lake Elsinore in Southern California. And, you know, essentially very wet to dry in, you know, less than 2,000 years. But yeah, so it's many generations, or, you know, many thousand years rather than on the generation time scale. But in other places, it could have been much faster. So
the collaboration that you have with researchers across the country is terrific. Can you talk about the enablers and the drivers that allow this collaboration, which is not, you know, is not something that people who went to school 20 and 30 years ago experienced?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's sort of the benefit of being a 21st century earth scientist, is that I very much have this like very broad network of people whom I work with, some of whom aren't even in North America. But I will say most of the people that you saw listed on the slides, you know, here and on some of the other slides, are California based, or they started in California and then during my time in California moved elsewhere. And so, you know, a lot of it is really, you know, started from my advisors. So Kate Maher was my master's advisor, and then my PhD advisor is Paige Chamberlain, shown here. And so a lot of the people that I collaborate with are sort of other students or former postdocs or affiliates of those research groups. But yeah, I think it's also been very interesting during COVID to experience, you know, all these virtual conferences, and you really have to make the most of all the networking that you can do. And I don't ever shy away from like asking someone just to chat for 15 minutes over Zoom to discuss a couple things, because I know there's not the random conference meeting up right now happening. So yeah.
Well, Dan, again, I want to thank you for an absolutely amazing talk. The idea of these dry basins filling to 100 meters and draining in such a short amount of time is simply incredible, and adds a whole nother layer to the story of the Western U.S. We also want to congratulate you on your upcoming professorship at Brown.
Thank you.
That's very prestigious. We'll miss having you in the West, but we would love to get you out here for a talk when things change.
For sure. I think with my in-laws living in Jackson, I'll certainly be in the area frequently. So
good. Well, we will have you, and we will look forward to having you in person. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight.